I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped into my backyard and my shoe sank 3 inches into the grass. Not after a flood, not after a hurricane, after a completely normal rainstorm. At first, I thought it was just one of those weird things nature does sometimes. You know how you can live somewhere for years without thinking twice about drainage? Then one season, everything suddenly decides to behave differently? That's what I told myself anyway. But looking back now, that muddy patch behind my fence ended up teaching me something I never expected to learn about neighbors, responsibility, and a strange way people react when a problem finally becomes their problem. My name's Ryan, and a couple years ago, I lived in a quiet subdivision outside a small town called Maple Ridge. Nothing fancy, just a row of houses with decent-sized backyards, kids riding bikes in the evenings, people waving when they passed each other at the mailbox. The kind of place where everyone mostly stayed out of everyone else's business, which is exactly how I liked it. I worked from home, always have. Most mornings started the same way. Coffee in one hand, laptop waiting on the kitchen counter, and 10 quiet minutes staring out the window before the day got moving. That's why I noticed the puddle. It appeared after a thunderstorm one Tuesday afternoon. Nothing dramatic, just a shallow pool of water sitting near the back fence. I remember glancing at it and shrugging. The ground was saturated. We'd gotten a lot of rain. End of story. Except the story didn't end. The puddle stayed there all week. Then another storm rolled through. The puddle came back bigger. A few days later, the grass started turning yellow around the edges. Then another storm. And suddenly what used to be lawn felt more like a swamp. Every step made a squishing sound. Mosquitoes showed up. The smell came next. That damp, earthy smell that never completely leaves once the soil stops drying out. One morning, I was standing by the kitchen window when my friend Marcus called. "How's life in paradise?" he joked. I looked outside at the muddy mess and laughed. Paradise is currently developing wetlands. What happened? I have no idea. At least that was what I thought at the time. The answer was sitting right behind my fence. The house directly behind mine had recently been purchased by a guy named Travis Cole. Nice enough the few times we'd spoken. Corporate type. Always looked like he was on his way to a meeting even when he was taking out the trash. For months, his property had basically been a construction zone. Contractors everywhere. New patio. Fresh landscaping. New gutters. New everything. I hadn't paid much attention because, honestly, it wasn't my business. Then one afternoon, I noticed something strange. A white PVC pipe sticking out from the back corner of his property. It wasn't huge, maybe 4 inches wide, but once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it. The thing looked oddly deliberate, like it had been placed there for a very specific reason. A few days later, another storm arrived, and that's when everything clicked. I was standing in my kitchen watching rain hammer the windows when suddenly a stream of water exploded out of that pipe. Not dripped, not trickled, exploded. The water shot across the property line and landed directly in the section of yard that kept flooding. I actually leaned closer to the window because my brain didn't believe what my eyes were seeing. The patio behind his house had been designed to collect runoff. The runoff fed into the pipe, and the pipe was launching all of it straight into my backyard. I stood there watching for several minutes. Not angry, not yet, just confused. Because there's a weird feeling that comes over you when you realize something you blamed on nature was actually designed by a person. And the more I watched that water pouring into my yard, the harder it became to ignore. The next morning, I decided to walk over and have a conversation. A simple conversation. At least, that's what I thought it was going to be. I had no idea that one knock on a neighbor's door was about to start a chain of events neither of us would forget. The next morning, I walked across the grass with every intention of keeping things friendly. That's important to understand. I wasn't looking for a fight. I wasn't rehearsing arguments in my head. I wasn't carrying screenshots, documents, or legal threats. I was simply a homeowner trying to understand why his backyard suddenly felt like the edge of a marsh. Travis answered the door almost immediately. Pressed polo shirt, coffee mug in hand, Bluetooth headset hanging around his neck. The guy somehow looked busy even while standing still. "Morning," I said. "Hey." I pointed casually toward the backyards. "I think there might be an issue with the drainage setup from your renovation." To my surprise, he didn't even look confused, didn't ask what I meant, didn't seem curious. Instead, he nodded. "Oh, the runoff pipe." I blinked. "Yeah, that's normal. Normal. The word hit me harder than I expected. I glanced past him toward the backyard. The water's flooding part of my lawn. He shrugged, not rudely, not aggressively, just the kind of shrug people use when they don't think something is their problem. Water flows downhill. I gave a small laugh. Sure, but this isn't exactly a creek finding its own path. Another shrug. The contractor designed it, and that was pretty much the end of the conversation. Not because he slammed the door, not because he yelled. Honestly, I almost wished he had. At least anger would have shown he cared. Instead, I got indifference. The conversation simply died. I stood there for a few seconds after he went back inside, staring at his perfectly finished patio and wondering how someone could see a problem so clearly and still decide it belonged to somebody else. A few days later, I tracked down the contractor. His name was Brent. Big guy, confident voice. The type of person who answered every question before you finished asking it. I explained the situation. He listened. Then he gave me the answer that would stay in my head for weeks. Our work meets code on the owner's property. That was it. I waited for more. It never came. So you're saying concentrating water into a pipe and sending it next door is okay? I'm saying the installation passed inspection. Passed inspection. Those two words somehow managed to answer nothing while ending the conversation at the same time. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen, staring out at the muddy section of yard. And for the first time, I felt something shifting inside me. Not rage. Something quieter. Something more dangerous. Determination. Because I started realizing nobody involved had any reason to fix this. Travis liked the setup because his yard stayed dry. The contractor liked the setup because he'd already been paid. The city wasn't aware of it. And every rainstorm was slowly turning my backyard into a sponge. The following weekend, another storm rolled through. This time I grabbed my phone. Then I started documenting everything. Videos, photos, timestamps, water flow patterns, how long standing water remained, the depth of the pooling, the condition of the grass. Every storm became data. Every puddle became evidence. I even bought a cheap notebook and started keeping records. Marcus found out and laughed. You've become a drainage detective. Apparently. You know, normal people watch football on weekends. Normal people don't have a swamp. The thing is, once you start paying attention to a problem, you begin noticing details you missed before. I started seeing exactly how the water moved, exactly where it collected, exactly why my property was suffering while it wasn't. One night around midnight, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table reading municipal drainage ordinances. If you told me 6 months earlier I'd spend a Friday night researching stormwater regulations, I would have assumed my life had gone horribly wrong. Yet there I was. Coffee, laptop, pages of legal language. And somewhere around page 37, I found something interesting. Natural drainage was generally allowed. Artificial concentration was different. The law treated those situations differently. A naturally sloped yard wasn't necessarily a problem. A system intentionally redirecting water could be. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. For the first time, I realized I might actually have legal options. I could call the city, file a complaint, request an inspection, start a formal process. And for several days, I seriously considered it. But every version of that future looked exhausting. Investigations, arguments, neighbor hostility, months of paperwork. The more I imagined it, the less interested I became. Because here's something I've learned. Winning a dispute isn't always the same thing as solving a problem. One afternoon, I walked into my backyard and started looking at the land differently. Not as a homeowner, not as a victim, almost like an engineer. I studied every slope, every low spot, every grade change, and eventually I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. My property wasn't the only one with a low area. Near the far corner of Travis's yard, just beyond the fence line, sat a shallow depression. Most people would never notice it. I barely had, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Water naturally wanted to move toward that corner. The realization sat quietly in my mind for several days. Not because I wanted revenge. That's the funny thing. People hear this story and assume revenge was the goal. It wasn't. I just wanted my yard back. Around that time, a landscaper named Owen Harper came highly recommended by one of my neighbors. When Owen arrived, he spent less than 5 minutes walking the property before nodding. Drainage issue. I laughed. Everybody figures that out pretty fast. He crouched near the fence and grabbed a handful of soil. This ground staying saturated way too long. Then I showed him the videos, the photos, the notebook, all of it. He watched quietly. No comments. No interruptions. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed. That's a lot of runoff. Yep. He studied the fence line. Then he studied the grades on both properties. Then he smiled. Not a big smile. Just the kind experts get when they finally understand the puzzle. What? I asked. He stood and brushed dirt from his hands. You don't need to stop the water. That sentence sounded familiar somehow. Maybe because I'd spent months trying to fight it. What do I need to do? He pointed along the back edge of my property. You guide it. I followed his finger. You build a berm here. Decorative. Clean. Make it look intentional. Add stone, plants, whatever you want. And that'll solve it. His smile got a little wider. It'll change where the water wants to go. I looked toward the fence, then toward the low corner beyond it. And for the first time since this whole mess began, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not because somebody was finally coming to save me. Because I suddenly realized I didn't need saving. I just needed a shovel, a plan, and a little patience. What happened next would completely change the balance between me and Travis. And after the next storm rolled through the neighborhood, neither of us would ever look at that fence the same way again. The following week, Owen and his crew got to work. Nothing flashy. Nothing that would make people stop their cars and stare. A few pallets of stone. Several truckloads of soil. Some native plants. A little grading. A little shaping. From the street, it looked like a landscaping project. Because technically, that's exactly what it was. But underneath that clean, decorative border running along my fence line sat something far more important. A carefully designed berm. Not a wall. Not a barrier. Just enough elevation to encourage water to make a different decision. I never mentioned it to Travis. Not before construction. Not during construction. Not after. There didn't seem to be much point. After all, I wasn't changing anything on his property. I was simply improving mine. A few days later, the weather forecast started showing a familiar pattern. Heavy rain. Thunderstorms. Potential flash flooding. I remember checking the radar that afternoon and feeling oddly calm. Not excited. Not nervous. Just curious. For months, I'd been reacting to the problem. Now, for the first time, I wanted to see if the solution actually worked. Around 6 o'clock, the storm arrived. The sky turned charcoal gray. Wind rattled the trees. Rain slammed against the windows hard enough to blur the entire backyard. I found myself standing in the exact same spot where this whole story seemed to begin. Coffee in hand, looking through the kitchen window. Waiting. Then I saw it. Water poured through Travis's gutters. It raced across his patio. And seconds later, that familiar pipe came alive. A thick stream shot across the property line exactly like it always had. Except this time something was different. The water hit the berm and stopped. Not completely. Just enough. The momentum vanished. The concentrated flow spread out. Flattened. Then slowly began traveling sideways instead of forward. I watched it move along the fence line like a train changing tracks. Following the natural grade. Searching for the lowest point available. Eventually disappearing toward that low corner I'd noticed weeks earlier. Toward Travis's side. Toward the place water naturally wanted to go. I stood there silently watching. No fist bumping. No celebration. No dramatic victory speech. Just relief. Pure relief. The next morning, I walked across my backyard. For the first time in months, my shoes stayed clean. The grass felt firm. Healthy. Normal. I didn't realize how much stress I'd been carrying until it disappeared. It's funny how small problems work. They don't seem important until they're finally gone. And suddenly you notice how much space they've been taking up inside your head. 2 storms passed after that. Then 3. Everything kept working. My yard remained dry. The berm blended into the landscaping so naturally that visitors assumed it had always been there. And then one Thursday afternoon came the knock. 3 firm knocks. I knew exactly who it was. When I opened the door, Travis looked different. Not angry, just frustrated. The kind of frustration people wear when reality finally catches up with them. Hey, Ryan. Hey. He glanced toward the backyard. My side yard's getting pretty muddy. I nodded slowly. Yeah. A long pause followed. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. Did you change something back there? I couldn't help smiling a little. Not because I want to rub it in. Because the symmetry of the situation was impossible to ignore. I did some landscaping. Another pause. Landscaping. Yep. He stared at me for a moment, trying to decide whether I was being clever, trying to decide whether I was hiding something, trying to decide whether he could actually blame me for anything. Finally, he sighed. Well, now all that water seems to be ending up on my property. There it was. The exact sentence I'd wanted him to understand for months. Not because I needed validation, because I needed perspective. I folded my arms. That sounds frustrating. His eyes narrowed slightly. For a second, I thought he might get defensive, maybe even angry. Instead, something unexpected happened. He laughed. Not a happy laugh. More the laugh of someone realizing he'd just walked straight into his own lesson. Okay, he said. Fair enough. That response honestly surprised me. It surprised him too. You could see it. The tension he'd carried to my front porch suddenly started draining away. The conversation changed. It stopped being about blame and started being about solutions. I told him about the drainage ordinances I'd found, the soak-away systems, dry wells, rain gardens, proper runoff management, the options that existed before any of this started. He listened more carefully than he ever had before. Then he said something that stuck with me. I guess I picked the cheap option. I nodded. Most people do. He looked down at his shoes. Until it becomes expensive. Exactly. A week later, a different contractor showed up at his house. Not the original guy. A new crew. They spent several days digging near the back corner of the property, installing underground drainage, gravel pits, perforated pipe, a proper absorption system designed to keep the water where it belonged. The next major storm arrived about a month later. I watched from my kitchen window again, out of habit more than anything. The rain came down hard. The gutters filled. The runoff moved exactly where it was supposed to. His yard drained. My yard drained. Nobody flooded. Nobody knocked on anyone's door. And for the first time in nearly a year, the fence between our properties became just a fence again. Not a battleground. Not a source of resentment. Just what's separating two backyards. Sometimes people hear this story and tell me I won. I don't know if that's true. Winning implies there was a loser. And honestly, I don't think there was. What I think happened is simpler. One homeowner ignored a problem because he couldn't feel it. Then eventually he could. And the moment he could feel it, he fixed it. But here's the question I still think about sometimes. What if I'd filed the complaint immediately? What if I'd gone through official channels? What if inspectors had forced the issue from the beginning? Would that have been a more responsible thing to do? Maybe. Or maybe it would have turned into months of arguments, paperwork, and bad blood between neighbors. I genuinely don't know. And that's why I'm curious what you think. Was I right to handle it the way I did? Or did I simply redirect the inconvenience until someone else was forced to deal with it? Where exactly is the line between protecting your property and teaching someone a lesson they refuse to learn? Let me know in the comments. Because if there's one thing I've learned from living around other people, it's this. Water always finds its way downhill. And eventually, responsibility does too.